This is PA Books, featuring authors of books about Pennsylvania's people, politics, history, and business. This week, Michael Smerconish discusses his book, Muzzled.
Michael Smerconish, author of Muzzled. Who's being muzzled?
All of us. All of us, and in all aspects of our daily lives, Brian. That's the argument of the book. And not only are we being muzzled, but it's having implications relative to the war on terror. That's really the message that I wanted to convey.
How?
Insofar as the way in which we've become touchy-feely, for lack of a better expression, here at home, I think is the same way that in many respects we're approaching our attempt to eradicate radical Islam. One of the most clear examples occurred relative to Zacarias Moussaoui after this book had already been published. And there have been so many instances after the book was published where something occurred and I said, boy, I wish I could have included that. I wish I could have included this. But with regard to Moussaoui, and I thought this made the case quite well, here's a guy who acknowledges his role relative to Al-Qaeda. He's disappointed in that he wasn't able to participate in the September 11 attack. 3 weeks or so before September 11, he lies to law enforcement, and there's a conclusion by the federal jury in the sentencing phase that had he told the truth, the 9/11 plot could have been unraveled. And he himself, as I say, pleads guilty to conspiracy. So now it's time for the jury to determine whether it should be life in prison or death. And in our judicial system, what do? We confront our own jury with a 42-page jury interrogatory, and we literally make them answer questions like, did he come from a dysfunctional family? Was his sister psychotic? Was his uncle abusive toward his mother? Did his mother entertain men at the home who were not her spouse? And all of these ridiculous, from my perspective, sidelights that were attempted to portray the very, quote unquote, difficult upbringing of Zacarias Moussaoui. In a word, we become sissified. I mean, we become sissies. It's a word we used to use when we were kids. We become such sissies that we're sitting there kvetching about Zacarias Moussaoui and his upbringing at a time when he's regretting the fact that he wasn't cutting somebody's throat with a box cutter on board Flight 93 or one of the other airplanes.
Is a questionnaire like that put to juries every time there's a murder case or a major case like that?
Great discretion in the hands of the court. And it was the judge in that particular case who mandated that they would actually have to review each and every one of these factors. Mitigating factors, contributing factors, they're all normally considered by the jury. But what was unique about that case was to make them actually take a vote on each one of these so-called mitigating factors. And that didn't get the news. What got the news was that the jury concluded that he should be given life in prison and not death. And I wanted to know, how could that jury be exposed to the Flight 93 cockpit recorder, something that you and I and all the Pennsylvanians have not and probably will not ever have the opportunity to listen to if we were so inclined because it's sealed? How could they have seen film footage that's been kept from us of individuals jumping from the Twin Towers and not come away prepared to put that man to death? And so in an effort to answer that question, I obtained a copy, as anyone could, of the 42-page jury interrogatory. And when I looked at it, I thought, my God, this is what we've become, so muzzled, so weak-kneed, that we're worried about Moussaoui's upbringing.
How do we get to that point?
Well, I think we got to that point in a way that's been snowballing for at least the last 40 years. And let me say right up front that I don't ascribe to individuals who are behind the political correctness that I describe in detail in the book, evil motivation. I'm not saying that there's an office in the United Nations and they're plotting a worldwide PC movement, and after they've addressed giving trophies to kids in youth athletics, they're going to move on to getting rid of red pens in grade schools, and then they're going to... It's not like that. I think the best of intentions are behind many of the things that I've written about. And individually, none of them poses a threat to our quality of life. But collectively, all together, I think it's become so enmeshed in society that it's everywhere. It's in our home life, our work life, our church life. It's all around us. And when you put the whole picture together, and what I try to do is tell 24 stories and document how PC is all around us, and then I make the case that this same mindset is also affecting the war on terror. How did it get so far? I think incrementally it's just grown and it's not been confronted. And if there's anything that I'm trying to do in the book, it's to spur a movement of folks who will confront political correctness and say, wait a minute, this has all gotten a little crazy.
Is it a Republican-Democrat thing or a liberal-conservative thing?
I try not to characterize it in those terms. I mean, if you were to say to me, ideologically, are most of the stories that you write about targeting individuals who are to the left or to the right, I'd probably say to the left. But there's material in the book that's equally critical of individuals who are on the right and have the same sort of a gut or visceral reaction to say, I'm intolerant to X, Y, or Z. What I'm really calling for in a word or two words, common sense. I want common sense to dictate. I want to go back to the days when we would resolve disputes with a hand gesture. And I'm probably not allowed on PCN to give you the hand gesture I'm thinking of. Instead of
we're cable, you can do that if you want.
All right, well, here it comes. No, I'm kidding. Instead of federal intervention and lawsuits, because everything today is grounds for federal intervention or filing a lawsuit.
Too many lawyers?
And here's a reformed trial lawyer making this case. It's not that there are too many lawyers, it's that we have a system that is so out of whack in terms of being quick to call somebody a victim. I mean, let me give you an example. Again, since putting the book to bed, there was a story about a woman who filed a lawsuit against Southwest Airlines that actually went to court, and she was saying that she'd been discriminated against, and she was discriminated against because Southwest had asked her to purchase 2 airline tickets. And I, again, procured the paperwork surrounding this lawsuit, and I wanted to find out what was the basis of her discrimination complaint. Well, what I found is that she was 5'6" and 235, and she couldn't fit into one seat. And they said to her in a very nice way, ma'am, you're going to have to buy a second seat if you want to take this flight. And of course, that becomes, no, you're discriminating against me now. If she could fit in the seat, there'd be no need, I guess, to discriminate against her.
What makes people so quick to file lawsuits?
Probably because many of them are rewarded. If some of them weren't successful, I imagine that you wouldn't see so many get filed.
Why are they successful?
Well, that's a great question. I think a lottery mentality has crept into many of the jury pools, not all across the Commonwealth, but particularly in the opposite ends and corners of the state. And it's not just in Pennsylvania. I think it goes on all over the place. And many times people get paid in lawsuits where they shouldn't get paid because corporate defendants, it's easier for them and makes more business sense in certain circumstances for them to settle those suits than to fight those suits.
Is there something you would do about the law regarding lawsuits, tort reform, or is it a societal thing? Well,
I think it's a societal thing. I mean, I'm not just talking about litigation in the book. There's not a lawsuit that can be filed that would cause little leagues across the Commonwealth to stop handing out trophies to kids for showing up, regardless of whether they win or lose. But that's something I think ought to occur. I mean, Brian, at home, I have 4 trophies. As I recall, 3 of them are for punt, pass, and kick. I don't know if they still have the tournament, you punt, you pass, you kick. And I also have one for a Little League Baseball championship. Now, I'm 44. I was a decent athlete in my day, nothing stellar. I have 3 boys, and they're 6, 8, and 10. Each of them has more trophies than I was ever awarded. But if you come to the house, theirs are gathering dust, they're broken, and they're under the bed. And that's because we haven't fooled them. They know they didn't do something stellar to be awarded that trophy. So we've not fooled them. And if anything, we've instilled in them a false message which says mediocrity, mediocre performance is going to be rewarded. And that's an example of the sort of thing that I'm talking about. And it's the sort of a case where you might look at it and you might say, okay, but what the heck does that have to do with the war on terror? Well, you've got to go through all the other examples that I present to understand how pervasive it is, and then to make the case that this mentality has now leapt into the war on terror.
You mentioned something about purple ink.
Right.
What's the purple ink story?
Red
you
ink.
Said purple is the new red, I think.
Yeah, well, listen, I saw way too much red ink when I was younger because that's the way they graded papers. And along the way, educators have now decided that, it's too much for a young person's psyche to receive a bad grade, a D, an F, or a poor comment, and also to see it in red, which is the color of blood. So Bic and Papermate, as I've documented in the book, have each seen a spike in their purple ink sales, I kid you not, because it's believed to be a softer way to present bad news. Why purple? After all, it's the color of Barney. I mean, we are bringing our kids up to be wimps. Consequently, that's why we show all this sympathy for a guy like Zacharias Moussaoui. That's the argument in the book.
What's your reaction when you hear the phrase self-esteem?
Self-esteem, it's being falsely created. I think we're giving too much of a false sense of self-esteem to young people. Look, the real world doesn't operate based on everybody getting a trophy. I don't know how it is in your employment. I assume that not everybody gets rewarded for just showing up. I can't believe that's the way that PCN is run. It's certainly not the way that my radio station is run. You show up, you work hard, and on the merit, you prove that you're deserving of the prize, whatever the prize might be, a good salary, a raise, job enhancement. We're raising kids today to believe that bad news comes with a gift wrapping on it, and that you're going to be rewarded in life regardless of how well you perform. That's just not the way the real world functions. It's not just ink and it's not just trophies. I deal with a lot of education subjects in the book. There's a trend toward giving mulligans on tests. You don't do well on the test, we'll give you a do-over. Don't worry about it. Or to get away from testing generally, or to get away from grades themselves. This is what's going on all across the country because we're hurting feelings when we assign bad grades to people who, guess what, deserve them.
Do you find that happening in the workplace too?
I think that it does happen in the workplace. I think that in the workplace, you get circumstances where people who should be fired, people who should be taken to the woodshed, so to speak, it doesn't happen because, well, that person, they may sue me. They may complain that their fanny got pinched along the way. I mean, I have a great story in here about how, in the context of an advertising, a sales office, a sales manager has a woman who is not dressing up to par. In other words, the way in which she's going out and presenting the company he thinks is inappropriate. His solution is not to counsel her one-on-one and to say, you need to do a better job in dressing yourself. Instead, it is to bring in the entire sales force and to distribute to the sales force a book that is arguably the all-time business bestseller, How to Dress for Success. A book that's been out for decades. It's sold millions of copies without any complaint. All of the individuals leave, they go home, they take a book with them. One of them never comes back to work. He never comes back to work, Brian, because within the 300 or so pages, he's found a couple of pages that give advice to individuals who want to make a sale with someone who doesn't look like they look. A white guy who wants to sell to someone who's African American, African American who wants to sell to somebody who's white. And by the way, the advice is always the same: wear a Brooks Brothers suit. But anyway, in this particular circumstance, the African American salesman who takes home How to Dress for Success doesn't come back to work. Instead, he files a lawsuit. And he says, I've been discriminated against because now you're giving me advice on how I, as an African American, should be trying to conclude a business transaction with a white guy. That's offensive and it's racist. And guess what? He gets a $600,000 award by the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission. I think that's nuts, and that's exactly what I'm talking about. And guess what? In that scenario, I'd be willing to hazard a guess that the reason the sales manager didn't single out the one person who was dressing poorly was because she's a woman. And he probably thought, if I single her out, she's going to say, oh, this is sexual harassment. You're singling me out because I'm a woman. What about all these guys? That's the sort of thing I'm talking about.
What are things that people are not allowed to say now? I mean, there are things that are just off limits. You get in trouble if you even talk about them.
Well, so many from the current headlines. We're having a debate today about illegal immigration. Oh, but it's not illegal immigration. These are undocumented workers. I mean, you can't say illegal immigrant, even though they're here illegally. And by the way, I don't have a solution for what we do with 11 or 12 million people who are here illegally, but I don't think I'm casting aspersions when I say they're here illegally. I'll give you another example. We're still trying to unravel what was this recent terrorist threat in Ontario, where 17 individuals who were motivated by Al-Qaeda, if not directly connected to Al-Qaeda, apparently had as much, 3 times as much tronium nitrate as Timothy McVeigh. So what did I read in the New York Times? I read that they are South Asian. South Asian? What is South Asian? Does that mean Vietnam? I mean, I'll take a number 4 with snow peas. Give me a break. They're Muslims. They're members of radical Islam. Why do we have to be afraid to say so? The Dubai port transaction was something that the White House proposed not too long ago, and people started walking around again, speaking in code. Well, we don't want to have foreign management of the ports. Foreign management? The Brits wanted to do a deal with the United Arab Emirates. It wasn't that it was foreign. We already had foreign management. The problem was Arab management of the ports less than 5 years post 9/11. But of course, everybody is afraid to say so. You know what it's like? It's like that story, The Emperor Has No Clothes. The emperor is buck naked, and people don't want to say anything about it. That's what I'm trying to bring home to people.
You write in the book, you talk about a federal policy to fine airlines if they have more than 2 young Arab males in secondary questioning. Why is that? Why should that be a federal mandate?
It shouldn't be. And you'll pardon me, but I've got to take a moment or two to sort of set this up, because it's a very important part of the book, and it actually relates to the first book that I wrote, which I never set out to publish. I want to give you the short version, or otherwise I'll eat up all your time. But a couple of years ago, 1 year post September 11, my wife and I and our 4 children, we were flying from Atlantic City, New Jersey to Fort Myers, Florida. And my then 8-year-old son was singled out for secondary or random screening. And I thought, that, boy, what a waste of resources. I mean, none of us have any commonalities with the 19 hijackers on September 11. I guess they, the screeners, know what they're doing. To me, it seems like it's a waste of resources. And so, there was my 8-year-old son being singled out for secondary screening. And it happened on the return trip as well. With that fresh in my mind, the televised hearings of the 9/11 Commission began. And there was a particular hearing, Brian, where Secretary John Lehman was questioning Dr. Condoleezza Rice. And he asked her whether she was aware of a quota system that was in place preceding and post 9/11, where the number of individuals who could be pulled out of a line at a security checkpoint, the number of individuals of a particular racial or ethnic stripe, was limited by the government. And she said, no, I know nothing about that. Well, I was so intrigued by that question that I tracked him down and I said, Mr. Secretary, where was that coming from? What was the basis for you asking that of Condoleezza Rice? And he said to me, well, we had testimony by executives from the airline industry who told us that the Justice Department had visited them and said, pre-9/11, do not pull out of line individuals of a particular ethnic stripe in any great number, or that will be perceived as discriminatory conduct. And after he shared this with me, I began an investigation to find out, is that policy still going on, and exactly what is the standard by which we make these secondary screening calls? And what I was horrified to find was that in the aftermath of September 11, airlines, including American, including United, which were stung on September 11, were being fined by our government when our government believed that they were making security decisions that in any way included identifying those commonalities of the 19 individuals on September 11: race, gender, ethnicity, appearance, religion. So to the extent that you were the pilot and you were given information that there's a guy in 3C and he's on a federal watch list, and by the way, he looks like he's from the Middle East, what do you want to do, Mr. Captain? And if the pilot then said, well, I'd like that individual questioned a little bit further before we pull away from the gate, that was perceived by our government to be discriminatory. And I read the litigation files. I wrote a book to bring this to light, a book called Flying Blind. And that really set the predicate for the follow-up, which we're here discussing now. But that it did occur. The government acknowledges that it occurred. It hasn't occurred recently, but it's one of the most distasteful aspects of the aftermath of September 11. Our government fined the very airlines that were hit on September 11 and lost all their own personnel because of quote-unquote discrimination.
Well, what would you do if you were in charge?
Well, let me tell you, if I'm in 4C, I only want to fly on that plane if the captain, when told that there's a guy in 3C who's on a federal watch list and of Middle Eastern descent, decides he does want him questioned. I mean, I don't want to be on the airline that says, well, we're going to overlook all those factors. Let me give you another example of how this continues, and also how I see what's taking place domestically as a form of cancer that is now metastasized into the war on terror. You want to know, where does that mindset come from? Where does the mindset come from that we're going to ignore the commonalities of these members of radical Islam, or that in the more current example, we're going to refer to them now as if they're from South Asia. I don't even know where the hell South Asia is. These are young Arab males, just like those who committed those acts on September 11. Let's say so. How are we going to defeat them if we won't even admit exactly who they are? But let me give you an example, a domestic example of where I think this comes from. headline comes out in the News Journal of Delaware just after the publication of my book. And the headline says, "Bearded Man Wanted for Rape." It was provided to me by a radio listener. And I thought, geez, as this listener thought, what a strange headline, "Bearded Man Wanted for Rape." Well, I read the story. The story told me that the man was believed to have committed an act of rape, that he had a beard, that he drove a Chevy. The Chevy was blue and the Chevy had 4 doors. And if I know who the bearded man is, then I'm supposed to call the Dover police at this telephone number. But it didn't tell me anything else about what he looked like. Now, how am I going to call the Dover police? How are we going to catch this guy, the guy who commits the heinous act of rape, if you don't even give me more descriptors than the fact that he had a beard? And the listener of mine had engaged the newspaper in a back and forth, wanting to know, why aren't you telling us more about him if you really want him caught? And they said, well, we don't want to cast aspersions. We don't want a whole community or segment of society to be held accountable for the act of one man. That's how asinine this has become. We're not going to tell you the race or the ethnicity of the rapist, even if we know what it might be, because we don't want to offend anybody. It all comes full circle.
Is there some point where you go too far in identifying people like that? I mean, if you're an Arab American who is middle class and not part of a terrorist group, and you start getting treated lumped in the same group with terrorists, is that okay?
I think it's unfortunate that some folks' civil liberties are going to be encroached upon in a post 9/11 world. But the country's at war. I think in many respects, we don't want to acknowledge, we don't want to admit that we're at war. And that's why a month ago in Denver, Colorado, an 83-year-old woman named Bea Bogart, a cancer survivor who'd had a hip replacement, suffering from dementia, in a wheelchair, hoisted out of her wheelchair to undergo secondary screening at the airport. Now that's lunacy to me. See, and that's window dressing. You're pulling Bea Bogart out of that wheelchair because you don't want Abdul or Mohammed, who might happen to be in line at that time, to say, oh, well, they're only just taking a look at me. I mean, let's stop with the subterfuge already.
Well, there must be somebody, a person who thinks that's a good idea.
Well, who thinks what I'm saying is a good idea?
No, who thinks that the current system is a good idea. I mean,
I'd like to know who that person is. I would love to know who they are.
Because you can say it's society that does that, but there's individuals who had to at some point decide that was a good idea.
You know, the concepts that I lay out in this book, and I've done a lot of speaking about this, and in order to write this book, and in order to write my first book, I have engaged any number of policymakers in a discussion, just like you and I are having now, except I'm usually on the other end of it, to talk about these policies. And I get universal agreement with what I'm saying. At a minimum, I get a wink, wink, nod, nod, you're right. The problem is that no one wants to be the champion of turning the tide against the things that I'm discussing, because to stand up and to say the sort of things that I'm saying, and by the way, I just don't care at this point, is to be branded with all these dangerous words, you know, a xenophobe or something along those lines. And if I have the opportunity to explain myself in a setting like this, where you've given me an hour to explain what's on my mind and why I wrote what I wrote, I'm completely comfortable with anybody who will listen to the entire presentation and make a judgment as a result. For example, when I say to you that the United Arab port transaction was a mistake because of Arab management of the ports that would have occurred, that may sound offensive to some folks. But if you give me the opportunity for the extended soundbite, then what I can explain is that in the 9/11 Commission report, the 9/11 Commission came to the conclusion that the UAE, the very folks who would have managed our ports, had denied us an opportunity to kill bin Laden after he declared a fatwa against the United States. Now, this takes on a 2 or 3 minute conversation, and usually it ends up on the cutting room floor. But the reality is that bin Laden said he was going to kill Americans anyway, anyhow. He said it verbally and in writing. And a year thereafter, we had a Predator drone pick him up as part of a hunting party in Afghanistan. This is pre-September 11. And the CIA wanted to take him out. This is on Bill Clinton's watch. All of a sudden, they recognized that in the midst of the hunting party were members of the United Arab Emirates royal family. And for that reason, we didn't take him out pre-September 11. As a matter of fact, Richard Clark was dispatched to Dubai to let the UAE know that we ourselves were hunting bin Laden while bin Laden was hunting with the United Arab Emirates royal family. And they dropped the dime, and we lost our opportunity to capture or kill bin Laden because he disappeared. That's why I think it's a mistake to entrust to the UAE management of our ports. If you ask me for the short version, I'm going to tell you that I'm uncomfortable with Arab management of the ports less than 5 years after September 11. Give me the opportunity to lay it all out. That's the story you get.
Do you get much criticism for your position? I mean, a lot of people are afraid to take some positions because they might be called racist or homophobic.
Well, I see, but that's what I think we've got to turn the tide on. I think that we've all become so afraid to offend one another that we've limited our ability, frankly, to get along. You know, in this effort to get along, and I don't want to offend you, you don't want to offend me, let's all, I think that we've done completely the opposite. Because now people are walking around with all these feelings and these emotions. What, you think these emotions are gone? You think these feelings are gone just because they're not spoken? No, they're pent up inside. So speak your mind. And by the way, not at the extremes. I mean, for someone to ever use the N-word, entirely inappropriate in any circumstance. So I'm making a call for some civility, but I'm also making a plea for some thickened skin. Somebody says something that offends you. I'm a bald guy. I don't know. You want to say something about that? I happen to be a Yugoslav. You know, my mother is one of 11. They're all upstate, and they will all be watching PCN on this interview. You want to make a joke about Yugoslavs? I'm not going to be offended. You know, get over it.
You say in your book that we have become a humorless society, or we are becoming a humorless society. What is it that it's still okay to make fun of?
White guys. You can make fun of suburban white guys who look like me, you know, whales on their pants and green ties at home and baldies and so forth.
Why is that okay? Why is that
I guess we're a bunch of geeks. I don't know, but you can't make fun. You can't make fun of different ethnic groups anymore because, oh my gosh, I'll tell you, in the book, and I know you read it, so you're aware of this, but people might find it interesting. I interviewed Jackie Mason. I mean, come on, the ultimate in Borscht Belt comedians, a guy who made his name on the type of humor that we're talking about. And I wanted to know from him, if you were to start your career today, do you think you could get it off the ground? And he confided in me the difficulty that he thinks he would have because, he gets away with it now because he's older and he's been around for so long. It's kind of like, the grandfather that we all have in our family where if Pop says something every once in a while that's inappropriate, it's all right. He can because, he's 80 or 90 years old now. We almost described that to Jackie Mason. But you couldn't go out as Jackie Mason today and tell jokes about Jews and Gentiles the way that he does and get away with it. I think that's a mistake. Too bad.
Can you tell jokes about Jews if you're Jewish?
Probably to your Jewish friends. But I think, again, there are all different rules that apply. I mean, I watch on HBO, and I love Chris Rock's humor. I could never say the sort of things that Chris Rock says. And maybe I shouldn't be saying them anyway. But the general message is lighten up.
What do you think about the First Amendment, freedom of speech? Are you an absolutist on it?
I don't think that I'm an absolutist. If I yell fire in the PCN studios, I mean, I don't think that I'm protected. There are some circumstances where I try not to be hypocritical. I try not to determine the politics and then decide where the thing ought to come down. After I wrote the book, I heard from somebody who said, well, my son once showed up with an anti-Bush T-shirt in a public school setting, and you didn't defend him, so you're a hypocrite. And my answer to that would be, well, if you showed up with an anti-Clinton T-shirt in a school setting, I think I'd come out on the same side of the fence. That in a school environment, there need to be rules of decorum. You want to wear an anti-Bush T-shirt walking the streets of Philadelphia, Harrisburg, or Pittsburgh, or Clinton, the same kind of a thing, I don't think anybody should have a beef. I saw a T-shirt in an airport recently. I want to get this straight and also say it in a clean way. And the T-shirt said, Buck, B-U-C-K, Fush, F-U-S-H. Can you picture that on a T-shirt? Mm-hmm. And I thought, how inappropriate. I was there with my kids, although I don't think that they sorted it out as quickly as I did. In a school setting, that would be inappropriate. To walk down Broad Street in Philadelphia, I mean, I like it, but you've got a right to do it.
What do you think about the FCC's recent efforts with obscenity and radio and television?
I think they've gone too far. I think that I think it's impractical in terms of what they've tried to do, and I've seen it on a very grassroots level because in my radio station at the time when the FCC was initially cracking down on Howard Stern, what they essentially did was they empowered an 18-year-old board op at my station to make decisions about what was content that crossed the line. And you know, it's like that famous Supreme Court opinion about pornography. I think I know it when I see it. I may have a hard time articulating it for you, but I thought that the FCC had gone too far in certain circumstances.
Now, for people who don't know, you mentioned you have a radio program.
Yes.
When is it on?
The radio program is on Monday through Friday. I do morning drive at a radio station that folks who've been around a while still like to affectionately call CAU, as in WCAU, which for years was a heritage CBS station. And the more modern incarnation is that we call ourselves the Big Talker 1210 WPHT. What
is a program like for you? If someone listens to it, what do they hear?
Well, I don't think that they hear from me. I hope that they don't hear from me a rant. I'm not one of the ideologues. I'm not someone who is there with an ideological agenda 5 days a week that I want to ram down your throat. What I'm there to do is to entertain you and to give you a healthy dose of news. And it's not just front page news. I do a lot of laughs and giggles as well, so that in a typical program, it's going to be one part heavy news, one part laughs and giggles, American Idol-ish, if you will, and a third part that'll be mixed and dependent upon interviews of the day.
How do you prepare for a program? I mean, do you have to really know everything that's going on in the world?
You know,
for every
Brian,
program?
what I think drives me is the fear of being embarrassed. I never want to take that phone call where someone says, "Did you hear about such and such?" when I'm clueless to that subject. And I think more than any boss could ever drive me to be prepared, I'm just of the type that I over-prepare for these programs. So I sign off the air at 9 o'clock, and it's not like I go home and eat bonbons and watch the soaps. I'm preparing constantly for the next day's show. I read all day long.
You say that your idea of a good time is to sit down with a stack of newspapers and just read them.
True.
And first of all, you also say newspapers as opposed to reading online.
I mean, I do read online, but here's the way my day begins. My day begins when the alarm clock goes off at about 3:20. And I'm on a very regimented schedule because I know what time I've got to be out of the house, to be at Wawa, to be on the expressway, to be in my studio, and it's not like there's any traffic, so I just know when I've got to hit the door. But my day begins by going to Wawa and picking up the hard copies of several newspapers, frankly, whatever they've got at that hour at 4 a.m., which is usually the Inquirer and the Daily News, USA Today, maybe a Wall Street Journal. And then when I'm in my studio, I get delivered the New York Times or the Journal or any of the aforementioned newspapers that wasn't at Wawa when I first got there. And then online, I've got a pretty sophisticated website, which I really created for my own personal benefit to be able to use the news links. And it lists all the newspapers that I go through in the course of the day. And I don't read them cover to cover, but I'm constantly looking all across the state of Pennsylvania and all across the country just for that one nugget of a story that maybe has been missed or glossed over by the media. Because that's really what I enjoy the most. I enjoy telling a story that's newspaper oriented, but maybe not the whole story has been published so far.
Are there news organizations, as you go through all this, that you have kind of categorized in your head about people who are either much more open or the bigger offenders in what you write about in your book, either people who are complicit in muzzling or who resist it? I mean, who are the good guys and who are the bad guys in the media?
I couldn't give you a list of good guys and bad guys. I think about the story that I told you a few moments ago about how the Muslim extremists and terrorists are now being referred to as South Asian. I'm seeing that all over the place. Undocumented instead of illegal immigrants in the immigration battle. I'm seeing that all over the place. The business about foreign ownership of the ports instead of saying United Arab Emirates or Arab management of the ports. I saw that all over as well. I think it's pervasive. The refusal to run the political cartoon of the Prophet Muhammad with a bomb protruding from his turban. universal all across the country. There were a handful of news outlets that were willing to run it, or to run it as a discussion piece, as the Philadelphia Inquirer did, to say, well, here's what everybody else is beefing about. So it's easier for me to say who the offenders are. They're just about everybody than to identify good guys, bad guys.
Where do you see courage?
By the way, I should have said good people, bad people, because if I say good guys, I think it's a sexist statement.
Where do you see courage?
I see courage in the realm of talk radio, and I see courage, unfortunately, sort of on the home front at the kitchen table, but not being expressed out in the front yard. I really believe that what I've written about and the things that I say resonate with Americans of every stripe. People they've had enough already of all this garbage, and they're ready to turn the tide, but not enough have stepped forward to pick up the mantle and do something about it.
Are some of these things just isolated incidents, like you talk about someone being sent home from school for wearing red and green at Christmas, that you could pick enough isolated incidents to make it sound like it's a trend?
Well, what I say, no, because there are so many. I mean, my God, it's a trend you pick an aspect of life, and chances are I can rattle off for you a story of something that has occurred recently. In that area. I don't believe that, and I tried to say this earlier, that by design they're unified. I don't think that the red pen people are related to the trophy people, who are related to the people who say don't give dress or sartorial advice for people based on ethnicity. I don't think that they're related to the story I tell in the book about the San Francisco 49er public relations executive who puts out his own sexual harassment video and gets fired. I don't think that all these people are on the phone, emailing, conspiring. I just think that each one of these is itself a reflection of what we've become. And if September 11 had not occurred, I would not have written this book, because they would have been minor irritants to our quality of life, but not something that threatened us. It would have been good fodder for a guy like me on talk radio to come in and on a particular morning, to tell one of these stories about things that are taking place. But it wouldn't have been threatening to the nation. Now I'm going a step further and I'm saying I think it's threatening to the nation.
I have to ask something. You say, is there a trend toward banning hobos and pirates at Halloween parties?
Indeed.
What's wrong with hobos and pirates?
That's what I keep asking. My kids. Listen, my kids go to great schools that are caught up in a lot of this business. I'll give you an example. Two recent examples. Example number one, the hobo and pirate example. Hobos and pirates are banned. By the way, they're not hobos, because that's an inappropriate term,
It is?
Yeah. I'm not sure what they're supposed to be. I think a shelter challenged or some such thing. Halloween time. You're now supposed to come as a person from a different country. Okay? Well, what do you mean? You're shaking your head like that's a good thing. What's wrong with a hobo or a pirate showing up for Halloween? That's the way it was when we were kids. We turned out all right, did we not? Here's another example. They had Grandparents' Day recently, and a note comes home. And it says, and mind you, this is now a day of school for young kids, grade school level. It is Grandparents' Day. If your son or daughter doesn't have a living grandparent, or a grandparent who can't make it to school that day, they need not come to school themselves if it would cause them discomfort. In other words, like if my parents are living and someone else's are not, my son or daughter is expected to be there, but that might be too much to ask of someone else's child, because they're going to have to now come to school and confront the fact that they don't have grandparents, and that could be upsetting. Hey, guess what? They already know, or they ought to know, that their grandparents are gone. And that's a shame that they're gone, but they ought to adjust to that already. Why are we hiding it from them? Why are we giving them a trophy? Why are we grading their paper in purple ink? I mean, this is all related as I see it. And guess what we're doing? We are raising that young man or that young woman, when it comes time to sentence Zacarias Moussaoui to life or to death, not to focus on the Flight 93 cockpit recorder, not to focus on 3,000 people who died, many of whom jumped to their death from the Twin Towers, but instead to sit there and to stew over the fact that his sister was psychotic, his father was a loser, and his mother brought home gentlemen callers. There it is in a nutshell.
Are juries too driven by emotion?
Are juries too driven by emotion? It's not so much that juries are driven by emotion, it's that the system that we've created forces them to contemplate the very issues that I've just articulated for you.
Now, we have had, right now as we speak, we have a Republican president, a Republican U.S. House, Republican U.S. Senate, and a Supreme Court that's predominantly appointed by Republicans, and these trends continue?
Absolutely, and that's why when you said to me, do you see this in Republican, Democrat, conservative, liberal terms, I said, no, I don't. I mean, the profiling issues, ooh, did I just say that dirty P word? The profiling issues that I've articulated in a post-9/11 world, to the extent that they are the fault of someone, and I believe that they are, they're the fault of this administration. Norman Mineta, the Secretary of the Department of Transportation, the first individual from the cabinet who should have been requested to tender his resignation after George W. Bush is reelected, instead is the first guy who's extended. And he's still there. And it's on Mineta's watch that the fining of the airlines that I earlier identified, United and American and two others, that it occurred. It's his fault. And I blame this president for that failed United Arab Emirates port transaction. I blame this president for the fact that people are speaking in code about illegal immigrants. I blame this president for the fact that B. Bogart, the 83-year-old woman in Denver, gets hoisted out of her wheelchair because, well, her number has come up for secondary screening. So believe me, this is not some book that's an apologist for the Republicans, much to the contrary, because it is happening on the GOP watch. I lay it out as such.
Is profiling okay?
Profiling is appropriate. Criminal or terrorist profiling is wholly appropriate in many circumstances, particularly when the country is at war.
What about in cases where African Americans driving cars are more likely to be stopped than whites driving cars?
Absolutely inappropriate. But that's not the circumstance that we have on our hands now. I mean, there are people who are speeding out there who are white, who are black, who are Indian, Chief. Right now, the country is fighting a war against radical Islam. And in most instances, not every instance, there are commonalities that associate these individuals. I mean, I defy anybody to take a look at the mugshots of those 19 individuals on September 11 and tell me they don't all look alike, because they do.
What do you think? You write in your book a little bit about Abu Ghraib prison, and what do you think when you read about stories about abuse of prisoners in situations like that?
What do I think? I think that there were 9 knuckleheads at Abu Ghraib out of 140,000 people who have served honorably. They did some stupid things, naked pyramids and so forth, some stuff that I haven't seen since I was in a fraternity at Lehigh 25 years ago, but nobody died. And to equate, those knuckleheads with individuals who cut throats with box cutters or decapitate, as they did to Nick Berg, is insanity. Apples and oranges, in my view. And I'm frankly, I'm sick and tired of the extent to which sympathy and condolence and concern has been expressed for our enemies. I'll give you a great example. Time magazine cover story last summer about detainee 063 at Guantanamo. And the portrayal is one of, well, this guy, he's an Al-Qaeda suspect and he's being tortured down there at Gitmo. Really? What did the torture consist of? According to Time magazine, which had access to the interrogation logs, we were playing Christina Aguilera music too loud in his cell. Come to think of it, that could be torture. We were altering the temperature of his cell. We were pinning the photographs of September 11 victims to his clothing. I mean, we were doing all sort of things like this to try and push his buttons, but nothing of a physical sense. Now, I know a little bit about this guy because I wrote about him in this book after doing a lot of research. He's an individual who attempted to gain entry into the United States on August 4 of 2001. He was someone who came to the Orlando International Airport. His name is Mohammed Al-Qahtani. And he was turned around by a very astute INS agent named Jose Melendez. Melendez looked in his eye and decided, quote, I just don't like him. He gives me the creeps. Those are the words to the 9/11 Commission. So relying on his instinct, he then undertakes an interrogation. And as he interrogates Mohammed Al-Qahtani, the guy's story falls apart. He turns him around, then he sends him packing back to Dubai a month in advance of September 11. After September 11, the 9/11 Commission pieces together Mohammed Atta's cell phone records and a calling card that he was using. And they determine that at the very moment that this guy was being spun around and sent back out of the country, that Mohammed Atta was there to pick him up at the airport. Mohammed Al-Qahtani was to have been the 20th hijacker. He was to have been the individual who would have been terrorist number 5 on Flight 93. And John Lehman and Richard Benveniste on the 9/11 Commission said, you know, if the INS agent had allowed this man to come into the country August 4, he would have been on Flight 93, and perhaps with that one added muscle, the terrorists could have kept the passengers at bay for the 20 more minutes that they needed, not to crash in Shanksville, but to make it to Washington, D.C. So let's step back now and take a look at this in the context of what I'm saying. What I see is Time Magazine putting detainee 063 on the cover and telling you about the way in which we're rough with regard to our interrogation. Me, I'm looking at that circumstance and saying, wait a minute, this is a guy who, if he'd had his druthers, would literally have been cutting someone's throat with a box cutter on flight number 93 to keep that plane in the air to crash into either the White House or the Capitol. Please, enough already with the sympathy for Mohammed al-Qahtani.
When a new issue comes up that you hadn't thought about before, or a new facet of an issue, and you have to decide how you feel about it, what are your core beliefs that you go to figure out what position to take on some new issue that comes up?
Boy, that's a great question. I don't know that I have a standard. I talk a great deal about giving a situation the hairy eyeball, or whether a circumstance passes the smell test. It doesn't necessarily relate to political correctness, but if I can give you an example, a recent example, it would be the whole Duke lacrosse rape case, alleged rape situation. And I didn't like the story when I first heard it. It didn't pass the smell test. And I think what I do is what a lot of people do, is just sort of apply your own life lessons to the circumstance. And in that case, if you said to me, there's a lacrosse team, and it's 46 guys, and it doesn't matter to me if they're black, white, or Indian, chief. I never thought that the race determined the outcome in this case. But if you said to me, there's one guy on that squad who raped a woman, and that's what this is all about, I'd say, well, okay, you know, one bad seed out of 46, yeah, I could see it. If you said to me, 3 guys raped a woman, and many more, maybe as many as 43 others had knowledge of it, had knowledge of some of the instances, had knowledge of some of the facts, and now we're all quiet about it, or that 5 guys were quiet about it, or that 10 guys, doesn't pass the smell test. I have more faith in humankind than that. And so from the first morning that story broke, I said, I'm a doubter as to this set of circumstances. More recently, the Haditha case, which we still know very, very little about in Iraq. If you said to me, one Marine snapped and he shot a civilian family in Iraq after watching his buddy, a 22 or 23-year-old Marine, killed in an IED. Okay, I could understand it. If you said to me, and we still don't know what the accurate number is, but if you said to me, a half dozen Marines went door to door in Iraq, shot a 77-year-old man in a wheelchair, a 4-year-old boy in the chest, and kept moving to the next house to repeat that, I'm not buying it. It doesn't pass the smell test. I don't know if I can explain to you why it doesn't pass the smell test, but applying my own life lesson, I'm just not buying it. You know, I think I'm pretty street smart. I had some extraordinary political experiences at an early age, have interacted with people from a whole variety of different perspectives, people of all different stripes. And I think that the political experience has given to me a good internal compass to size up situations. And it's a skill that I also, I think, used when I was practicing law. That's what I apply.
How old were you when you started getting interested in politics?
I was 18 years old. I was at a public school in Pennsylvania, in the suburbs of Philadelphia, Central Bucks West, which is, or had been, one of the perennial football powerhouses. And in my senior year of high school, my father, who really had not been politically active before, ran for an open seat in the Pennsylvania state legislature. And he ran and he lost, but it was nevertheless one of the great experiences of my life, because I then graduated from high school and I began my undergraduate studies at Lehigh University, and I got all fired up for Ronald Reagan and George Bush in that 1980 campaign. And from that, I then had a whole succession of terrific political experiences. Brian, I was in the right place at the right time on any number of occasions relative to politics. And those experiences, I was given a lot of responsibility in different political campaigns at a very, very early age. When I was 29, I was appointed by George Bush, meaning the father, Bush 41, to manage HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development in 5 different states. Jack Kemp was my boss at the time. And I think by having those different life experiences, it's put me in a position where most days, not every day, but most days I've got a pretty good barometer as to the things that go on in the news.
You worked for Frank Rizzo for a time?
Frank Rizzo, 1987, managed his attempt at coming back to City Hall. It wasn't to be. That was Rizzo Good 2. Wilson Good had defeated Frank Rizzo in 1983 in a primary election. This was Rizzo now as a Republican trying to level the score, but didn't do it.
You mentioned you were a lawyer.
Yes.
You do not practice anymore?
My license is active. I maintain a relationship with the Beasley Law Firm in Philadelphia. Jim Beasley was a legendary trial lawyer who we lost, I guess, by now a year and a half ago. So I'm still affiliated there, but no, on a day-to-day basis, I do not practice law.
Why'd you give that up?
Because I'm too busy eating bonbons and watching soaps all day long. Oh yeah, and getting ready for tomorrow's radio show. My hands are full. I write, I speak. I'm singly responsible for 17 and a half hours of content on the radio. I mean, think about that. That's a lot of programming for one person to sustain. And I also do a tremendous amount of television work in all the usual, cable outlets at night.
You do a column for the Daily News?
Every Thursday.
Available online?
Available online at philly.com, and if you don't mind, I have a website where people will learn more than they'd ever care to know about me. It's my initials followed by the word talk, M-A-S talk.com. I usually say masstalk.com, but then the Catholics put in an extra S, and they never seem to find the site. I think I need to control Mass Talk, M-A-S-S talk.com. I probably confused everybody now. M-A-S talk.
We'll type it up and put it on the screen. If people want to hear your radio program, is it available online?
Finally, it is. The radio station, which is called the Big Talker 1210, has a sophisticated website. You can log on. We stream via the internet, and it's relatively easy to do. I'm all thumbs when it comes to a lot of that stuff, and I've been able to do it easily.
Was this book fun to put together? I mean, it's full of a lot of things that you're outraged about.
I mean, I feel like I've spent my time on PCN today telling you about the hot button issues, but it'll give you a laugh. I mean, if you don't laugh throughout the course of this book, then I've done something wrong. I mean, I think it was Sean Hannity in one of the blurbs on the back, or someone who said, this is a book that will make you laugh, and then it's going to make you cry. Because I try to tell some stories through humor. I mean, can I give you one more?
Sure.
How about a guy who goes into a bar in New Jersey? It sounds like the beginning of a joke. A guy goes into a bar in New Jersey. It's ladies' night, meaning that the cover charges have been reduced for women, and so too have the drink prices. Why? Same as it's ever been, because if you attract the women, then you attract the guys are there to meet the women. But on one particular night, after this has been going on for decades, one guy comes in, he's offended by the fact that women are paying less for drinks, files a legal challenge, and has the entire process of ladies' night offerings overturned in New Jersey. You can't have a ladies' night. Why? Because one guy was offended and he was discriminated against. And very recently, the whatever they call the Angels out in California, the baseball team, I guess the Angels at Anaheim or some such thing, guy goes in on Mother's Day and doesn't get a tote bag. Why? Because the tote bags are for moms. He's offended, he files a lawsuit, and now tote bags in the future will not be given just to mothers. This is the sort of thing I'm talking about. So, it's funny on one hand to think about one guy who's offended about ladies' nights, like, hey, get a life, buddy. But on the other hand, it's more of that touchy-feely mindset that I see in the Moussaoui verdict. It's more the touchy-feely mindset that I see with the guys down at Gitmo. It's more the touchy-feely mindset that I see in pulling an 83-year-old woman out of a wheelchair because we don't want to offend the guys who look like radical Islam, and on and on and on. That's how it's no longer just a domestic irritant. Political correctness is something that threatens our ability to win the war on terror.
Are you optimistic or pessimistic about the direction this country's heading, about the future of America?
I'm talking to you at the tail end of 2 solid months of being all over the place talking about this book, and I've really been well received. And are there detractors out there? They are. They send me crayon-written letters all the time. But by and large, the people with whom I speak, if I have the chance to fully present the case, and I feel like I've had that chance here today, they agree with me. And you know, it's kind of, people say to me, well, what is it you want to do about this? Why have you written this book? What do you hope to achieve? What I hope to achieve is that scene in Network, if you remember the movie Network, where the guy goes to the window and he throws it up and he says, I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore. I'm trying to sort of lay down the gauntlet here to start the battle for people to take control of these different circumstances incrementally in their own lives, in the same way that this has been building for 40 plus years.
How would you have somebody do that? I mean, if someone was watching this and thinking, well, what do I do? How do I respond to situations like that?
Well,
what
first of all,
advice do you
stop being so damn offended about everything. You know, if you're in some folks' company and they tell a joke, or if you're in the workplace, and I don't mean the real offensive stuff. I think we all know that which is way over the line. But let's get over it. Not every boneheaded maneuver by a family member or a colleague, a coworker, is something that's grounds for a formal complaint. If a guy hands you a book and it says, this is how you should dress, and if there are 4 pages out of 300 in it, show up for work the next day. Don't run to the courthouse. I mean, all the instances that I write about in this book are circumstances where I think people should have just let it roll off their back.
I have to ask you about a couple of words. Did you coin this word, hatriolic?
I did. Thank you very much. And if people who watch PCN could repeat that word, hatriolic, I'm trying to get some credit in Webster's.
You heard it here first.
Yeah. Well, actually not. See, what happened was I used that word. I misspoke. I got tongue-tied somewhere between hatriol and vitriolic, and it came out hatriolic, and I was made fun of for it. And then I kind of liked it, and I thought, hatriolic, that's kind of cool, because that is what I think we've become, you know, hatriolic in many respects. Don't you like that word, hatriolic?
That's a good word. You also used the word punctuationists.
Well, that must have been a mistake. Are you sure I didn't have an S on there that I meant to delete?
Punctuationists.
that I meant to delete. Listen, I'm not the grammatical expert. I'm a guy who's writing to tell a good story and keep a smile on your face at the same time. At least I hope.
And again, if people want to hear your program, how do they hear it?
The radio station is called The Big Talker 1210. Google us. You'll find the website, and from there, you can also go to my site. I'm giving out all these darn websites. mastalk.com gets you everywhere.
This is the book we've been talking about, Muzzled, and we've been talking with its author, Michael Smerconish. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brian.